So let's start with the why. Why I'm teaching this class. Perhaps why you've signed up for it, right? Across the developed world, but in America especially, we're experiencing something more than what we might call polarization. What we have experienced really over the last several years is the tearing of the fabric of our society. There's like this torn social fabric that's very dangerous, not only for our politics, but for our democracy as a whole. Democracy is based on compromise. And if people no longer have common goals, if they can't compromise with each other, or they don't want to compromise, they want to fight, then the system, the brilliant system that our founding fathers created 200 odd years ago won't function, right? It's meant for a polity that has a sense of common purpose, or a coherent set of common purposes. And the fact that we've been disrupted, and we've, as I'll talk further when I get to my talk, that the society has evolved significantly in the last 50 years, but unevenly, right? The joke is that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And so this stretching out of our culture through growth is part of the way we can understand how things have gotten so hyperpolarized. But both the why and the how is something that we'll be returning to and elaborating on throughout the course. But it's just important to start and put a stake in the ground and say, this is important because the future of American democracy is important for human history. So that's the first why. Not only is the stretching out, the disintegration of our culture the result of growth, the solution, I would say, I'm going to argue, and I hope to demonstrate, is to grow further, to grow into a better version of ourselves. And while that might at first sound rather idealistic or merely aspirational, the details of how the growth that has gotten to where we are, understanding the development of our civilization and our culture, that points clearly to the not only the strategy but the tactics of how we can foster and cultivate the further growth we need, not to grow back into some perfect unity, but to grow into a functional polity wherein democracy can function in a as it was designed to do. Right. The joke is that the U.S. government was designed by geniuses so that it could be safely run by idiots, and the genius of that design is dependent upon a degree of commonality of purpose, and so that's at least the beginning of an understanding of where we're going in terms of the growth that we hope to foster both in ourselves and then outward by circles into the larger society. In this little talk, I want to emphasize what we're after. And that is, we're after a perspective. That is, for the advanced students of this way of thinking, what really this is about is an emergent new worldview in history, right? A new cultural location, a new type of consciousness. But that's a bit overstating it at this point, because developmental politics can be extremely useful just by this perspective alone. Right, you don't need a new worldview. People have a right to be who they are, and wherever you are politically right now, I'm not asking you to change your political position. What I'll be asking you to consider to do is to expand the scope of what you can value, even while you retain your current political loyalties. So, the perspective, one way of thinking about what this perspective is that it's a perspective that's outside and above. In other words, we're looking down at the culture war rather than being trapped in one side of politics or one particular ideology. We're taking a step out, not necessarily permanently, but just to get a vantage point, which we call higher ground. And I'll justify why we can think we can get away with calling it higher or outside and above. But the substance of this perspective, which we'll be examining and developing throughout the course, one way of describing it that we found has got a decent amount of traction is the idea of cultural intelligence. right? So since emotional intelligence was popularized by Daniel Goleman in the 90s, everybody wanted to be culturally intelligent when they heard about it. There's now a wide range of different intelligences that are talked about, for example, in the leadership literature. But if you Google cultural intelligence, the way it's talked about now among consultants and in business circles is more like cultural manners, business manners. Like when you go to Japan, right? You're supposed to know that you present your business card by bowing, right? That's what they mean by cultural intelligence. What we mean by cultural intelligence is somewhat different. It's this ability to recognize culture, to see into it, to see into its structures, to see into its tensions, to see into the trajectory of its development more clearly. Again, this politics of culture it depends upon an enlarged cultural perspective. That cultural perspective is gained by stepping outside of the current political spectrum and reviewing or broadening our understanding of all the different political factions within the United States from this perspective of cultural intelligence. And so cultural intelligence is a class in its own, but I just want to mention it here as another way of describing this perspective, this outside and above perspective that we're after. I think I can define, just like I wanted to define culture, I want to define perspective. It's simply the dictionary definition of the faculty of seeing all the relevant data in a meaningful relationship. So the entire culture of America is in a whole series of meaningful relationships, both micro and macro, and understanding not only the participants of those relationships, but the relationships themselves, their dynamic interaction and how they've gotten stuck is what this perspective can do and why it's worth working to adopt. Part of the way so in the slogans like cultural intelligence and the politics of culture and all these different ways of describing what this view of politics is, some people are triggered by the idea of higher ground. Like, who are you to say that you're higher? Aren't you setting yourself above everyone else? And I think that's a valid critique that deserves to be responded to. We want to make the world a better place, right? We want to make politics in America better, and indeed in Italy and all over the developed world where polarization is increasing. And so when we want to make things better, I argue from a philosophical perspective, we can't flinch with our duty to say what's better. But rather than either just have an absolutistic, this is better and this is worse, or a relative perspective that says we can't really say what's better or worse, we want to improve our definition of improvement itself. We want to develop our concept of better, or our concept of development. And that means we have to put a stake in the ground about what's better. So what is better? I think more inclusivity is better. I mean, that is when you move from a perspective of ancient tribes people who saw their tribe only as worthy of moral consideration, their blood kin, because the other tribes were trying to kill them, right? And then there was an evolution from a sort of a family-centric or tribal-centric sense of morality to a more ethnocentric. In other words, the people who count, who are morally worthy, are the people who are members of your religion or your nationality. Now we're seeing, with the rise of progressivism, the emergence of a more world-centric morality, where not only does every person count morally, but all sentient beings are worthy of moral consideration. And so that's a growth in inclusivity, moral inclusivity, the inclusivity of care. And I believe, and I think I can make the argument, if anybody wants me to elaborate further, that this is an authentic way we can talk about better. But it's not the only dimension of better. Indeed, we could talk about the intrinsic values of the good, the true, and the beautiful are ways that we can make things better. And while different forms of culture are not absolutely better or absolutely worse in stark terms, there is this growth of inclusivity. The reason that we can say this perspective is higher is that I think it has more explanatory power. It can explain why 74 million people voted for Donald Trump, why 82 million people, or however number it was, voted for Joe Biden. We can understand what motivates people more effectively when we gain this perspective of cultural intelligence. And I think the justification for higher or better or outside and above that I like the best is that from this perspective, it allows us to appreciate a wider spectrum of value. I'm going to argue in classes to come how value can be profitably understood as a kind of energy. We're energized by that which attracts us, that which motivates us and compels us. And so when we think of value as something we metabolize, just like you could increase the health of your body by metabolizing better nutrition, well, this perspective, as I hope to demonstrate, allows us to metabolize a greater quantity and quality of value. And one of the ways we talk about the evolution of consciousness itself is by expanding the scope of what people can value. And that idea is really based on one of my favorite ideas in all of philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead, who is an eminent philosopher, one of the founders of integral philosophy. He actually defined evolution at every level in the universe as the capacity or the increase in the capacity to experience what's intrinsically valuable. So this is a sort of a consciousness-centric definition of evolution, which recognizes the growth of the world in terms of entities that can perceive value. And the difference between the prokaryotes and chimpanzees is that chimpanzees actually can experience greater intrinsic value. They have a limbic system, right? They have a family. And as humans emerge, we can experience a whole wider range of value, and we continue to grow our ability, our horizon of potential improvement expands. That's one way of conceiving the evolution of culture itself. So this higher ground perspective and the development of culture does have some empirical backing. One of the places that I point to in terms of evidence for the evolution of culture beyond anecdotal evidence of things are different than they were in the 50s is the World Values Survey. And this is a multi-decade sociological survey of values that's been initiated by the University of Michigan. Ronald Engelhardt was founded in the 70s, and it's surveyed values in 190 countries. They've got a gigantic database, and they show that since the 1950s, there's been a significant growth in value perspectives in the developed world. They use the terms allegiance values, right? Sort of traditional, you're allegiant, you conform. The move from allegiant values to assertive values, like people want what they want. They're politically active. They have grievances, right? That's a kind of a move. And then the World Values Survey also charts the emergence of what they call post-material values. And this is what we would call progressive values. So we can say more about the empirical foundations of this, although what I'm describing is political philosophy. It's not social science. We certainly want to learn everything we can from social science, but we're not limited in our observations to only what social science can say. I can also talk about this perspective from another important perspective that many of you people are familiar with, and that is one of probably the world's most prominent and respected developmental psychologists. He teaches at Harvard. His name is Robert Kegan. And he's written many books about the evolution of consciousness, primarily from a psychological point of view. And Kegan's developed what he calls the subject-object theory. The idea being that one of the most straightforward ways that people's consciousness evolves is that they take what was previously their subject, what had them, and they're able to step outside of it and see it from the outside. They're able to make subject into object. So for example, people who grew up in a religious household, who are deeply religious and have loyalty to the teachings of their religion, which is a beautiful thing. I'm certainly not disparaging that. But for many people who are traditional religionists, when they are confronted with facts or science that contradicts their religion, they have to kind of construct reality to match their subjective religious view. They're captured by it. And when they evolve, when they grow in their perspective, they may still have their same religious loyalties. They may still identify with that religion, but they're able to see it from the outside. So the way Kegan puts it is that, that the religion, they have the religion, that the religion no longer has them. And that's true not only of religions, it's true of all of these worldviews. The ability to step outside of it is an evolutionary move. And that's really a way of describing this perspective, this outside and above perspective, which we'll be unpacking and developing in the weeks ahead.